part of this course, not all of it, but part. This course, as you know, is going to take you through a long sort of panorama from the 16th century through the 17th century onto the 18th century, and even with Madame Palma, a little bit of the early 19th. My part basically mirrors my area of expertise, okay? I am a historian and I have always worked and I have done my doctorate in what is known as the early modern era. Early modern era means in French, la période moderne. But we need to be very careful when we talk about période moderne, because in French we don't say early modern, and it could be misconstrued, misunderstood. The early modern era is the very beginning of modernity. That is to say, when we talk about early modern, we mean the period that comes after the Renaissance and before the Enlightenment, in between the Renaissance and Enlightenment. So it comprises the 16th and 17th centuries, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about for part of this course. So some of you already met your seminar, well, in fact, all of you have already met your seminar tutors. The people who are registered for the, I think it's Monday seminar, are with my colleague Claire Schiano, and you had your introduction to the course and to the methodology of the course with her on Monday. And then the other two groups met just before, between 10 and 12, one with Madame Palma and one with myself. Now, your seminar groups, they never change, okay? You are in the group for which you are registered, and that remains the same throughout the year. For the lectures, it's going to be a little bit different. You're going to have me for 8 weeks. First 4 weeks, the 16th century. Second 4 weeks, so up to week 8, the 17th century. And then we're going to move on to Madame Palma for the last 4 weeks. Okay, so I hope this is clear. I have registered all of you onto the Amétis page for this course. If you're here, hopefully it has worked. Now, I do insist, please, try and go on Amétis every week. You will find there all sorts of indications that are useful for you for the course. These indications can be very practical matters. There will also be the PowerPoint slides for every week, sometimes always for the lecture, but also sometimes for your seminars. Basically, everything that you need to know and be kept informed about is going to be on Amétis, so please use that page. It's especially more important at the moment because of the particular circumstances we are teaching in at the moment. So, you know, if you feel lost or anything, hopefully indications will be on Amétis. I see that all of you have actually given a name to that profile, and that's really useful for me because I don't like it when I just see, you know, iPhone or whatever, and I don't know who it is. What's also going to be really helpful, and I know that a lot of you can't do that, but some of you, if you can, I would very, very, very much like it if you could switch on your camera, if only for a few minutes. I see Maëlle has already done it. Thank you very much, Maëlle. Sylvie, thank you. Thank you so much. Lisa, if you can, okay? I understand that some of you can't, and some of you can, but you just don't want to. That's okay. But, oh, that's fantastic. I can see people. I can see real people. Fantastic. It's not like the kid in The Sixth Sense who said, I can see dead people. No, I can see real alive people over there. Thank you. Okay. Now, you don't have to do this every time. You don't have to do this for the whole duration of the lecture. But it's brilliant the fact that I can see you. Voilà, là, j'en ai plein. J'ai des vrais visages, des jeunes visages, des gens qui sourient. Ça me fait plaisir. Voilà, un petit peu d'humain. before I move on, I also want to insist on this, okay? Normally during the lecture, I like to keep my lectures very lively as I can. But during the lecture, I can see your faces. I can see if I've lost you. I can see if things are going too fast. I can see all of your reactions. Here, I can't. And so I will be judging through the few people's faces that I can indeed see, but also through the chat, okay? Now, it's really important to me that you don't fall behind. My idea is to make this course as pleasant and as lively and as interesting as possible, but you need to do your part as well, okay? So if there is anything you don't understand, don't hesitate to interrupt me, either by switching on your microphone and ask a question, or to do so in the chat, okay? So do that, ask questions. If you don't dare do that during the lecture, then please feel free to send me an email via Ametis or in a different way, I don't mind, but send me emails if you have any problems. And because of the situation in which we are right now, I know some of you are not badly affected and some of you really are finding this very difficult. I will say this now, I won't say it every week, but please remember that you can actually go to the library if you want. The university library is open. You just need to register for it. And you can go then with a friend if you want. You don't have to stay on your own all the time in your room, okay? So don't remain isolated all the time if it's proving difficult. Also, my other thing to say is from a human being to other human beings. It's very difficult usually to remember that the person in front of you may not be having a great week, may be having difficulties. And sometimes...
Et quand tu reviens, j'ai la caméra un peu là.
Whoop, we've got somebody with a microphone on.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Wendy. So if we have difficulties, even if they're not about the course, okay? If they're about the course, ask me the question, fine. Even if they're not about the course and you have other issues and you have nobody to talk to, try me or anybody else, but don't stay alone and isolated, all right? Okay, so I'm now going to start the course itself, unless you have any comments or any questions before we begin. No? Okay, right. Again, very helpful for me to see some of your faces. You don't even know how helpful it is to me. It really is really good. You know things are bad when you're getting really excited because you've seen some students on the screen. If you can't switch on your video, you could perhaps put a photograph in your profile, a photograph of you or an avatar, any sort of photograph. As I said before, the only sort of selfie I don't want is your sexy selfie. I don't want that, okay? But I can have all sorts of funny, humorous, historical, selfie with the cat, whatever. They're all very good, but they will be helpful for me as well. Okay, are we ready to begin the course itself? If I can see you, you can give me a nod. Yeah, excellent. Okay, so I will share my screen with you now and we will begin. Hopefully now, in a couple of seconds, you will be able to see the screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you, Adam. I'm going also to try and have the chat open. All right, chat open over there. People's faces over here. It's more complicated than it should be, really. All right, diaporama, c'est parti. Here we go. So this is our first lecture together, and the lectures are 2-hour-long sessions, so this is really quite long. We will try and have a little break in between the 2 hours, but also you will notice I try and vary the pace during the time of the lecture. Sometimes it goes a little bit faster, sometimes it goes a little bit slower, sometimes I tell anecdotes, sometimes I'm quite theatrical. All of this seems like I haven't thought about it at all, but I have. And all of this is meant strategically to try and keep you as interested as possible in the course. So lecture 1 and the very first part, we're going to meet a monarch, Henry VIII. He was King of England between 1509 and 1547. And the reason why we begin with him is because it was during his reign, under his rule, that England completely and utterly transformed. Before Henry VIII, England was a very small and rather uninteresting kingdom. Why do I say uninteresting? Because it did not differentiate itself from the rest of Europe. It was tiny. England is 5 times as small as France, 5 times as small. It did not yet rule over Ireland. It did not yet rule over Wales, and it certainly did not rule over Scotland, which had its own monarch. So England was just simply a small kingdom. And like every kingdom in Western Europe, its king was in fact a vassal to the spiritual authority of the great universal church of Rome, the Catholic Church. But during the rule of Henry VIII, sometime between 1509 and 1547, England is going to go through what has been deemed the first Brexit. For the first time, England is going to take itself away from the rest of Europe, to break away from Rome and to become autonomous, self-reliant, independent, to call itself an independent empire. Right, now then, let's move on. First of all, I need to explain to you what England was like before this change. So that's my first part. And you will find, of course, as I said, all my PowerPoints will be in the Amethyst, on the Amethyst page, all right? So first of all, I need to make it clear that England, before the break from Rome, had only a limited national power. And that was because that power was always subservient to that of the Roman Church. So my first title, A Limited National Power, the Interference of the Roman Church. To give you context, if you had been alive in the 16th century, and maybe you were, who knows, if you had been alive in the 16th century and you had been an English subject of Henry VIII at the beginning of his realm, you would have had 2 masters. For the state, your king was your liege lord, and you would bend the knee to him. However, for spiritual matters, we all belonged in Western Europe to the Roman Catholic Church. That Roman Catholic Church was universal. That's my first point, in Western Europe. The Catholic Church was a supranational structure. In fact, in Greek, katholikos means universal. So that Catholic Church was universal. And it applied, and it was respected and obeyed in all the provinces of Italy, in France, in Portugal, in Spain, in England, in Scotland, everywhere in Western Europe. Everybody was a Roman Catholic, believing in the Catholic creed, obeying the authority of Rome, of the Pope. Okay? And that applied to all of us. One universal church. The Pope, at the head of that hierarchy, was considered infallible. Vous prenez le mot faux, fallible, somebody who can fall, infallible, somebody who cannot fall, infaillible. The Pope was considered infallible. It was believed that he was the direct successor of Saint Peter himself. He clergy was represented in each country by thousands and thousands of clergy. In France, in Spain, in Portugal, in England, thousands of clergy represented the Pope. Those members of the clergy were organized sometimes in monasteries or abbeys or convents, but also as secular clergy with priests at the bottom of a hierarchy. Then above priests, do you know what's above priests in the hierarchy? I'm sure you know, some of you.
Bishops.
Bishops, absolutely, very good. Priests, then to administer the diocese, le diocèse, there are bishops. And then above it, I see Claire saying archbishops, absolutely. And in England, there were two archbishops, the Archbishop of York and the Archbishop of Canterbury, the same today, it's exactly the same today. Archbishop of York, Archbishop of Canterbury, representing nearly the top of the hierarchy in England. And then above the two archbishops, there was one per country, one. Any guesses?
A cardinal.
Yes, excellent. One cardinal, one per country. And the very apex, the very, very top of that pyramid is the Pope himself. Every country in Europe, therefore, enjoyed only a limited amount of power and national autonomy. In a way, everything that was from the state was dealt at home, but anything that had to do with the church or with spiritual matters belonged to the authority of the Vatican in Rome. And perhaps you don't actually realize what that means, because it's not just about things of the soul. It has very tangible ramifications. Let me show you one aspect of those ramifications. The church had immense fiscal, financial power. Fiscal or financial power. Okay, what type of financial power? Well, basically, for instance, the church benefited from a lot of taxes that were paid by the people of each country. As an institution, it gathered a lot of its resources, which were directly collected as taxes. Attention, pas des taxis, on est bien d'accord, des taxes. Hein? That was my little nephew who said to me, I don't understand. Uncle Simon says he always has to pay for taxis. Why does he take so many taxis? Not taxis, taxes, obviously. So financial power, taxes. Let me give you examples. They're only examples, there were more than that. But there was, for instance, a tax called Peter's Pence. Peter's Pence is a contribution which is paid by every landowner. So if you own a piece of land, even if it's small, annually, each year, annually, yearly, you will need to pay a contribution, an annual tribute to the church. C'est ce que l'on appelle encore aujourd'hui le denier du culte. Landowner, you pay your annual tribute. That's only if you're a landowner. But if you're not a landowner, or if you are, everybody has to pay the tithe. The tithe is one of the most unpopular and the most difficult tax to pay because it applies to everyone, whether you're rich or poor, even if you are destitute. The tithe was paid by everybody to support the clergy. And regularly there were revolts against the payment of the tithe, especially in periods, I don't know, of flooding or drought when the harvests were really bad, periods of famine, war, disease, pandemics. When people were having the same problem as we are now and much worse, much, much worse, and they were losing their jobs and they were starving to death, they still had to pay the tithe, which represented 1/10 of anything you had. So if you only have 10 carrots, well, you have to give 1 carrot to the church. Of course, here I make a caricature of it all, but you can understand how this was a very difficult tax which applies to everybody. Financially, therefore, each country paid an enormous amount of tax which did not benefit the kingdom. This tax evaded the kingdom and went away to fill the coffers of the Vatican in Rome. These donations were sometimes resented by the people and their monarchs, and they were seen as a sort of vampiric act, if you wish, where the church was bleeding the kingdom dry. All this money went away rather than staying and being used in the kingdom itself. The church was immensely rich and became richer every day. So that's an aspect of the church's power. Another aspect goes with the first. It's economic power. Oui, c'est la dîme, Issani, vous avez tout à fait raison, c'est la dîme en français. Economic power. Now, with this financial power goes economic power because the church was a major landowner. A major landowner. Do you know how much land in England actually belonged to the church and not to the king or to England? Do you remember the proportion? Some of you saw it with me last year, but it's a long time ago. No?
More than half.
Nearly half, over a third. Absolutely, thank you. Nearly, well, not quite half, but nearly, about a third of the land in England belonged to the Catholic Church. Now, usually that belonged to the monasteries. You would have a building, a monastery, or an abbey, or a convent, but usually the convents were not quite as wealthy as the monasteries and the abbeys. And they owned vast expanses of land. And perhaps again, you don't realize what this means, but in the 16th century, to own the land was everything. On the land, you owned the buildings of the land. And so anybody who lived on your land was a tenant who paid rent on these buildings. On the land, you also had resources, such as the woods. Woods and forests, hugely important because you build your average house with wood. Seuls les gens très riches et les églises étaient construites en pierre. La plupart de toutes les habitations étaient construites en bois. D'accord? So wood is a very important resource. Wood is also very important because that's what you build ships with. And please remember that England is an island, and the only way to defend an island is with ships, boats, a fleet. Wood is important because it is a combustible. Wood is important as well because forests are where you hunt. You hunt rabbit, you hunt all the birds, you hunt everything there is to hunt in order to feed. So owning land meant that you had access to those resources. The same with rivers. Rivers means running water. On the running water, in the water you have fish, but the water is also used to power the mills. Mills to make wool, mills to grind the flour to make the bread, mills to separate the cereal, etc. So economic power, by being a landowner, owing a third of the kingdom, a third therefore of the resources of the land. Also, of course, you'd have cattle, pigs, cows, goats, but more importantly, sheep. Sheep were gold on legs at the time. Gold on legs, why? Because of their fleeces, because of their coats. The coat of a sheep is called a fleece, and the fleeces of English wool were of extremely good quality And at the time, that was the one thing that England traded with incredible profit. They sent their wool, their English wool, onto the continent in great quantities and for great revenue. Great revenue. So sheep as well, etc. So you get an idea of the fact that the monasteries had great economic power. They were employers also, of course, of a lot of the population, and that was important. They had incredible power, especially in places where the crown's authority was far away. Say you live in, perhaps that's not going to talk to you very much, but say you live where I used to live, in Lancaster. Lancaster is all the way up in the north of England. The people all the way north of England, and you know that trouble always comes from the north, always. If you live all the way up north, you've never heard of the king, or hardly ever, and you certainly are never going to see the king. The people who really have authority are the local landlords. And very often, those local landlords are the monasteries. So they have that power. Other types of power that the church has, and that's perhaps a bit more surprising, is that the church had incredible political, but also judicial power. Let me explain why. Do you know why? How come the church can have political power in England? Power to make the law, power to extend their authority over the court. Canonical law, yes, absolutely clear. What does that mean? Any ideas? Vous pouvez me faire oui ou non, ou faire le hamster de base. Not sure? Okay then. It may be linked to crime coming from sins. Absolutely, Alizé, you're quite right. And the House of Lord is Annie, you're both right, and Claire also. So let me explain both of my adjectives here. Political power. How come the church had political power? You remember, you know, that the laws in England and basically the government in England, even today in 2021, is divided in, the parliament is divided into two houses. The house of Commons, that proposes the laws and votes them. And then if it goes through the House of Commons, it then goes up to the House of Lords. Who sits in the House of Lords? I make no apology for the obvious question. Who sits in the House of Lords? The Lords. Yes, okay, but explain. Yes, and also, of course, the aristocracy. Aristocrats, noble family. Yes, you're all absolutely right. In the House of Lords, the aristocracy sits. Lord Ingram, Lord Smith. Bien entendu, il n'y avait pas un... Peut-être qu'il y avait un Lord Smith d'ailleurs, déjà à l'époque. So all the noblemen who had been noble for enough time sat in the House of Lords, as well as the representative of the Catholic Church, bishops, archbishops, cardinals, which means that for each law that was discussed in England, House of Commons, okay, and then House of Lords, in order to be voted, the law needed to have the consent of the bishops, archbishops, and cardinals. Does that make sense? Yeah, do you follow that? So that's how the church had incredible political power. Now, what about the justice system? The justice system was two-pronged. A prong, c'est comme une fourche, d'accord? Two-pronged, il y en a deux, three-pronged, il y en a trois, tout simplement. The justice system was two-pronged. It had two branches, if you wish. There were the state courts. If you went on trial for instance, having a fight in the pub with your neighbor because he had stolen some of your grain. Okay, that was a secular trial, lay trial at the king's bench, le banc du roi, ça s'appelait, okay, the state court. But there was also another type of justice with the ecclesiastical court. I'm giving you enough time to write that long word down. Ecclesiastical, don't forget it's got a double C, ecclesiastical courts. The ecclesiastical courts, pardon me, had a separate justice system. But what's interesting is that they intervened in more topics, perhaps, than you imagine. It's not only, I see that perhaps, if I remember, it was Alizé that said a crime coming from sin. Yes, absolutely. Any crime coming from sin was to be judged and tried by the ecclesiastical courts, but not only. For instance, if you were a tenant of a monastery and you had a complaint with your landlord, then it was dealt by the ecclesiastical court because your landlord is the monastery. D'accord? Donc si par exemple, votre proprio vient d'augmenter votre loyer, ou si au contraire, vous ne payez plus votre loyer depuis un certain temps, en tout cas, il y a un problème de loyer et que votre proprio, c'est le monastère, eh bien, vous n'allez pas aller au tribunal séculier, mais au tribunal ecclésiastique. Si vous êtes, par exemple, le fermier du coin et que votre champ donne sur le champ ou la forêt du monastère et que vous avez une dispute par rapport à la borne et au cadastre et que vous n'êtes pas d'accord là-dessus et que vous vous mettez un procès aux fesses. Ça ne sera pas un procès séculier, mais un procès ecclésiastique. Vous voyez ce que je veux dire par là? And so the ecclesiastical courts actually dealt with a lot of things that had nothing to do with sin, but had to do with the jurisdiction of the church as a landowner or an economic partner. Does that make sense? Is that okay? All right, thank you. So, of course, this is going to be our starting point. You realize that in England, but not only in England, everywhere else in Europe, sources of authority are double. There is the power of the crown, and then there's the power of the church. And really, to be honest, the power of the church outweighs the power of the crown in many respects and in many domains. Which will lead me to my second part. My second part is about a man who's going to play a very important role, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. And we're going to see how he was very much the embodiment, the incarnation, the embodiment of the status quo. What do I mean by that? Okay. We've seen that there were very much two types or two sources of authority. And we're going to see how Thomas Wolsey belonged to both. He had a foot in each camp. And in himself, he accumulated the power that came from both sides. But by incarnating, by embodying the power that comes from both sides, when both sides came into conflict, if you want an image, we can say that Cardinal Wolsey was bound to explode and disintegrate. Okay? Conflict. So this is what we're going to see now. The example of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Thomas Wolsey began at the very bottom of the ladder. He was a self-made man, very astute. Quelque part, j'ai envie de dire, probablement un gros mafieux, parce que sinon il ne serait jamais arrivé jusqu'au bout. C'était bien connu He had shady dealings with a lot of people. He had no qualms about allowing his enemies to suddenly disappear. He had absolutely no remorse. He was extremely ambitious, but it worked for him. Who was he? He began in 1509, as I said, as a very simple, bottom of the ladder clergyman. He was dean of the little town of Lincoln. Lincoln is not a major town. It doesn't have much power or wealth or anything like that. And dean is not a very prestigious or important position in the church. He starts low. But he also managed in 1509 to become the royal almoner, and is going to make the most of that. Now, what is an almoner? En français, c'est un aumônier. On remarque bien la même étymologie. L'aumônier, c'est donc la personne qui va dire la messe, etc., sur le champ de bataille, qui est là, si vous voulez, c'est comme une espèce de prêtre portable. D'accord? And so, because he is royal almoner, he works in the vicinity of the king all the time. Whether the king is hunting or traveling or going to the field of the cloth of gold, which was like a massive festival, if you wish, he, Wolsey, was always there in the presence of his royal highness. Now, little by little, he made himself indispensable to the young king, especially since, and those of you who did the option with me last year, well, you will remember that, especially since young Henry VIII, at the beginning of his rule, was much more interested in hunting, playing tennis, having sex with lots and lots of women. He was much more interested in having fun than he was ruling the kingdom. More and more, Wolsey became indispensable to the king, advised the king, counseled the king, and he gained and gained in personal interaction. He also climbed the ladder in the church. In 1513, he became dean of the city of York. Et là, on voit que le gars, il a déjà une petite idée derrière la tête. Parce qu'il n'y a que deux archevêques en Angleterre, je vous l'ai dit, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop of York. If he tried to become Dean of York, it is not random. He's got York, he can soon become Archbishop of York. The man has ambition, I have told you. C'est pas grave, ces dates-là, si vous vous en souvenez pas, c'est pas grave, ne les apprenez pas par cœur, elles ne sont pas nécessaires, mais c'est pour vous donner un repère par rapport à son ascension fulgurante. The next year, after being Dean of York, he becomes Bishop of Lincoln, and in the same year, Archbishop of York. Incredible ascension, so quick, so fast, so louche. Nobody does that, but he did. 1514, therefore, Wolsey is now Archbishop of York. That is to say, the second most important cleric in England. There was Cardinal, and then there's him, the Archbishop of York, and then the Archbishop of Canterbury at the same level. Thomas Wolsey accrued an incredible amount of wealth. He became so wealthy that he was even wealthier than the king himself. Personally speaking, he had more wealth than the king himself. And I've given you here a photograph of Hampton Court as an illustration of his wealth. Hampton Court is immense. And if you look on the internet, if you look up some drone pictures, you can see how vast it is. That was his house. Ouais, pas mal. Bon, moi, j'aurais mis une piscine, personnellement, mais bon. Okay, now, obviously, I'm having a laugh here, but the idea here is to show you that this man had a castle, Hampton Court, which was bigger, more modern, and more magnificent than any of the king's castles. It was ultra modern. You can see all of these. These are chimneys. It had lots and lots of fireplaces in every room, and those fireplaces were huge, and you would burn immense amounts of wood in them so that the palace would be warm, which is, I mean, it doesn't exist a warm palace at the time. He had even the ancestor of central heating in it, because he had a system of pipes which would carry the water, and hot water being carried through pipes gives central heating. Rien que ça, Monsieur Woolsey. Woolsey became the ambassador to all the ambassadors of Europe. When they wanted to influence the king, they did not go and see the king himself. He was too busy and he was the king. But they would go to Hampton Court and they would stay at Hampton Court for weeks and speak with Woolsey. Woolsey became, if you wish, a second king in the kingdom. He was Archbishop of York and incredibly powerful, and also very, very powerful because he had the ear of the king. Accrued an immense amount of wealth. He had, this is in Oxford, colleges in Oxford built by his own personal fortune, with his own gate here, with his cardinal hat on them. He was very much a megalomaniac as well, okay, very proud of himself and his achievements. Okay. However, the fact that he was accruing so much wealth and so much power was going to put him in a delicate position. On the same year where he became Dean of York, Bishop of Lincoln, and Archbishop of York. Alors, il n'y a pas de question stupide, hein, Maeva? If you have a question, you ask it. What makes one proceed up the hierarchy? It very much depends. Usually, if you go through the hierarchy, I want to say honestly, it takes years. You only become Archbishop toward the end of your career, after you have been an excellent administrator of the church, after you have gathered an excellent reputation as a holy man, after you have served the Pope for years. However, like in every career, and especially where political power is important, a lot of people cheat, a lot of people manipulate, a lot of archbishops or whatever sometimes get poisoned, etc., etc. So basically, to answer your question here, all sorts of factors at the time could contribute. In the case of Woolsey, there is absolutely no doubt that there was ability. He was an excellent politician, an excellent diplomat, but also, I want to say he was a bit like Trump. There was no stopping him. When he wanted something, he would get something. And if he needed to get rid of a few people in the doing so, no problem. Okay, he was really quite a monstrously ambitious man, and he obtained what he wanted at all times. But as I said, this is all very well, but potentially dangerous. And he was going to make the experiment of this danger and experience it in 1514 on the same year of his success. The case of Richard Hugh. Now, what is the case of Richard Hugh? Alors, je fais attention parce que souvent je parle, et puis je fais pas gaffe à mes notes, et je sais pas si j'ai tout dit ou pas. Alors, j'y suis là. Okay. Who was Richard Hugh? Richard Hugh normally should never have been known in the pages of history. He was simply a London merchant, a normal man, a London merchant. But his case was going to create a precedent in the English court at trial. What happened was that, tragically, Richard Hugh and his wife lost their newborn baby son. And for the burial of their baby, their local priests, or their local priest in the singular, requested that Hugh should give him the baby's little christening robe. When you were christened at the time, et d'ailleurs, si vous allez, vous pouvez aussi le chercher sur Internet, ok? Si vous allez chercher des photos des baptêmes des enfants de William et Kate, par exemple, vous allez voir que les bébés portent des longues robes. C'est très démodé, mais c'est encore tout à fait le protocole royal. Okay, well, at the time when you were christened, whether you were a baby boy or a baby girl, you would be clothed in beautiful little robes, embroidered very delicately. And those robes would remain in your family from generation to generation. Every child would be christened in the robe. Now, for some reason, I don't understand why, and I don't think anybody knows why, the priest demanded for the burial of the baby, as part of his payment, that he should be paying money, but also that the christening robe should be given to him. And yes, it is an heirloom, absolutely. And obviously Hume refused, did not want to give his dead son's valuable, delicate heirloom away as payment for the mortuary fee. So when the father refused, the priest sued him. And obviously, because he is a priest, he sues him in the ecclesiastical court. So we have a trial between Richard Hume, a merchant, and his priest at the ecclesiastical court. Hume replied, and he launched an appeal. And he launched his appeal to overturn the decision, because of course at the trial the ecclesiastical court said, yes, you have to give your robe to the priest. So Hume appealed, and when he appealed to the king's court. Et là vous voyez le petit problème, on met comme ça en porte-à-faux, on met en opposition les tribunaux ecclésiastiques et les tribunaux séculiers. The king's court was therefore called upon, the king's bench. And the king's bench ruled differently, ruled that Hume did not have to give his robe to the priest. But the ecclesiastical court would not overturn their verdict. And because they would not overturn the verdict, the king's court actually indicted the ecclesiastical court for something that is called prémunire. Prémunire. What is prémunire? Prémunire is a Latin word. On va en voir plusieurs des mots latins. Prémunire is a Latin word, and it means the offense. That's right.
How do you spell it, please?
Pardon?
How do you spell it?
Prémunire, normally you should see it on the screen.
Okay.
Yeah, all right.
Thank you.
Okay. So prémunire is the offense of introducing a foreign authority into England. The offense of introducing a foreign authority into England and of recognizing this authority as superior to the authority of the king. What the King's Bench did was basically it disagreed with the ecclesiastical court. So when the ecclesiastical court said that Hume needed to give the little baby's robe and the King's Bench did not agree, they were in conflict. And the King's Bench, therefore, accused the ecclesiastical court, or not the King's Bench, but Hume accused the ecclesiastical court of prémunire, the offense of introducing a foreign authority into England. Basically, there was now a dispute between state law and church law. Je ne veux pas vous compliquer l'histoire parce qu'elle est extrêmement compliquée, comme tous les cas légaux, hein, c'est le cas. Mais ici, on a un conflit tout simple, quelque part, entre l'État et l'Église. It all became very acrimonious, and it became even more acrimonious when Hume was imprisoned by the ecclesiastical court, sent to the ecclesiastical prisons, And very soon he was found dead in his cell. Scandal. Crisis. And the crisis reached such a climax that the king himself became involved, demanding that the ecclesiastical court should obey the law of the land. Et là, on a vraiment un vrai conflit. Vous voyez comment les deux vont se tenir tête. The king is upset and the church will not give way. And you're going to tell me, how does that impact Wolsey at all? King's Bench, that's the name of the state law. Sorry. At the end of 1514, young Henry VIII directly refused to bow down to the papal jurisdiction on this matter, and he became involved. And Wolsey, even though he was archbishop, now found himself in a very delicate position, very difficult position. He was caught between his king, the temporal power of his kingdom, and his pope, the spiritual power which he represented also. Wolsey is stuck between the king and the pope because he works for both of them. And very, very nearly in 1514, he very, very nearly became crushed in that conflict between the two. And that is when, by miracle, poof, Richard Hume was found dead. Et donc, du coup, il n'y a plus de conflit puisqu'il n'y a plus de procès. Bizarre quand même, hein, le gars, il est mort, tout seul. On est bien d'accord, il est probable que ce soit Wolsey qui l'ait fait disparaître. Ok. Yes, please.
Qui est-ce qui est mort? Je n'ai pas compris.
C'est Richard Hume, celui qui était à l'origine de ce procès. Et donc, du coup, il n'y a plus de procès puisqu'il n'y a plus de plaignants.
Ok,
Et donc,
merci.
Voilà, du coup, il n'y a plus de conflit. Parce que Richard Hume...
Il est mort dans quelles circonstances?
Pardon?
Il est mort dans quelles circonstances?
Ah, mais ça, si on le savait, il est mort dans sa cellule. On ne sait pas comment.
Okay.
Voilà. On l'a peut-être aidé un tout petit peu à mourir tout seul dans sa cellule. Toujours est-il que plus de procès, plus de problème. And Wolsey escapes with his life. And he escapes, and he's so good that in the end, he even benefits from this crisis. In 1515, he is appointed cardinal by the Pope, and the same year, he is made Lord Chancellor by Henry VIII. So please don't be all, put off by the details here of the case. The details don't matter so much, but what you need to remember is that this case, the case of Richard Hume, is a very early sign of what's going to happen soon. It was a very early sign that there could be a conflict between the power of the king on the one hand and the power of the Pope on the other hand, and that they were going to clash. At the end of all this, though, as I said, Wolsey emerged without a scratch on him. Even worse, he benefited from the crisis. He was seen as the one who had solved it, after a fashion. And so he became cardinal. And now Wolsey is cardinal of England, the only cardinal of England. But he was also appointed by Henry VIII Lord Chancellor. And now the Lord Chancellor is the equivalent of the Prime Minister. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Mais ça veut dire, j'hallucine, que Wolsey, il est à la fois l'ecclésiastique le plus puissant de tout le royaume, il n'y a personne au-dessus de lui en Angleterre, mais il est aussi le plus puissant des hommes politiques de tout le Parlement, à part le roi lui-même. Donc en fait, au-dessus de Wolsey, il y a le pape et le roi, et c'est tout. Wolsey est l'homme le plus puissant du royaume. He is both cardinal and chancellor. Is even, ça je le dis en passant, going to accrue even more power with the trust of the Pope when he becomes the special papal legate, le légat du pape, in 1518. There is no stopping this man. Here he is in all his splendor, Cardinal Wolsey, the most important clergyman and the most important politician of England under Henry VIII. Ok. Je vous l'ai promis, on le fait. Micro-pause. D'accord? Alors, moi, je vais enlever ma petite caméra. Et puis, on se retrouve dans genre 3 minutes maxi.